So, hello everyone. My name is Juliana Veras, and I am an advocacy coordinator on drug pricing and health systems for Médecins du Monde France. And I'm glad to be here with you today to moderate this panel. It's a very interesting panel. So our aim now will be to discuss and highlight the current problem of profiteering and of power imbalance in favor of big pharma companies during the context of this pandemic. Thank you for those who were able to join us. And we have today 3 speakers with us, 3 very inspiring activists from the international movement of access to medicines. So I would like to welcome Candice Homer. Candice is advocacy officer at MSF Access Campaign South Africa. We have Pretty Crystal. She's co-founder and co-executive director of the organization IMAC. And we have Pauline Lodex, which is an activist, and she's co-founder of the Observatoire de la Transparence Médicaments. So Candice, Pretty, and Pauline, I would like to start our panel by letting you shortly introduce yourself. We would like to hear a little bit of who you are and the background of your activism. So Candice, please, could you please start?
Okay, hi everyone. So my name is Candice Homer, as I have been introduced. Sorry, I don't have my video on because I have a bit of a technical issue. But yeah, so I'm the Access Campaign Advocacy Officer working for Médecins Sans Frontières, and I'm based in Johannesburg. So my work seeks to advocate for access to medicine, diagnostics, and vaccines, ensuring that they are available, affordable, and accessible in the context MSF operates. This work has historical prominence in the battle for affordable HIV and AIDS treatment in the early 2000s, where thousands of people were dying globally because they could not access the medicine needed to keep them alive. South Africa at the time was amongst the countries ravaged by this HIV and AIDS, not only because people could not afford the medicine required, but faced with government denialism of the disease. So my work seeks to look at multiple barriers that still prevent access to life-saving medicine, which range from some treatments are simply too expensive for patients to afford, and other medicines are going out of production, and some are abandoned in favor of more profitable products. In other cases, the only medicine available are ineffective and has toxic side effects. So despite the gains made in the fight for ARVs, 20 years later, we are still fighting the same battle for systemic change efforts, and that must be drastically stepped up to overcome the challenges limiting people's access to life-saving health tools. So that's the work that I do in South Africa, but also connecting it with the work globally as well. Thank you.
Please, Pretty.
Hi, everyone. Like Candice, I started doing my work at the peak of the HIV epidemic in the early 2000s. I was working for an organization called the Lawyers Collective when I finished my law degree. They're an India-based organization of health and human rights lawyers. And through that work, I really learned how many people, over 2 billion, they said, before the pandemic, worldwide were not getting access to the medicines that they needed. And by 2006, I co-founded IMAC with my co-executive director, Tahir Amin, and we really started to focus in on the idea of how do you address some of the power imbalances in the system for medicines. And when we say medicines, we're talking about testing, treatment, and vaccines. We're talking about the whole spectrum of things that people need to stay alive and stay healthy. One of the core pieces of our work has been to focus on the patent system. because patents are, in their simplest form, they're monopoly rights that are driving so much of the power imbalance today. And with our partners like Pauline or like MSF worldwide, we're really trying to correct for how far in favor of the companies this root source of power has gone. And so after many years of working in the Global South, we decided to now, since about 2016, we're working more in the United States. And in part because, you know, the playing field for these issues is not really level. America is in many ways the birthplace for the modern day system for medicines. And we thought we would come here and figure out how to investigate and expose a lot of this structural inequality and perhaps remind Americans that there is a much larger world out there. It is global, it is interconnected. Humanity and health are interconnected. And so we're doing our small part here now to try to amplify some of the issues we've worked on with our partners globally.
Thank you, Preeti. Pauline, please.
Thank you, Juliana. Hello, everyone. Hello, Preeti. Hello, Candice, and everyone in the audience. I would like to thank the organizer of this Congress for the invitation and setting up this panel. So my name is Pauline Lodex. I started working on HIV and AIDS in 2005 as a volunteer of ACT UP Paris in Paris. And after around 2008, I worked full-time for ACT UP on the international issues at ACT UP, including access to medicines. So until 2012. And since 2012, I've been working as a consultant mostly for various organizations based either in northern countries, or in low and middle income countries. In 2019, last year, I created with Jérôme Martin, my colleague and friend, we created the Observatoire de la transparence dans les politiques du médicament, an organization looking at transparency issues in France. We created these organizations following to the World Health Assembly resolution that was adopted in May 2019, because the member states of WHO agreed during this WHO that transparency, that lack of transparency was a major issue, a major barrier to access and to the sustainability of health systems in the world. So why transparency? Transparency because lack of transparency has consequences in low-income countries, in middle-income countries, on access. It prevents people who need it to afford the drugs that they need, drugs and also diagnostics and vaccines. And in orphan countries, like for instance France, these high prices threaten the sustainability of our health system, because we have seen since 2014 that the price of medicines keep increasing, and we don't know if there will be a limit in this increase of price. And so we think that transparency is now critical to guide better health policies and to sustain our health system.
Thank you, Pauline. Thank you, Preeti and Candice. Thank you for your work. So let's start our conversation. So I have a more general question to ask you. And it's more broadly related to our problem, which is our panel is on big pharma profiteering of the pandemic. So according to each one of you, what are in the first place the mechanisms that make possible the whole situation of big pharma profiteering during the pandemic? So largely, we have intellectual property as a barrier to access, and we have an overall lack of transparency. But which mechanisms makes that this problem is still an actuality now that we need much more solutions, and we are all in this pandemic? So how do you see from your point of view, Candice?
Yeah, so thank you so much for the question. I think it is quite a sad reality that, as I mentioned, that we have fought this battle like 20 years ago when we were fighting for access to ARV treatment, and still today and not a lot has changed. We're still fighting a lot in terms of pharmaceutical profiteering, and I think the system is actually very much allowing for it to happen. And I think a very important aspect to this is also a question of government will, and I think government choice is quite a critical thing, that in as much as we have all these mechanisms in place, but if there's no government forthcoming and actually exercising the mechanisms in place to ensure that there's access, then I think that also is one of the biggest problems that we are faced with today. And I think it's also, I mean, we see that in South Africa, for example, where you have these TRIPS flexibility, and we have had, an ongoing sort of process of reforming our patent law. This has been going we've been advocating for this for the past 10 years. And today we're sitting with a policy and not so much of that policy sort of reflected in our national law. Therefore, we cannot exercise, some of these mechanisms to ensure that access to medicine and public health is safeguarded. So I think the question around government willingness is quite a critical factor, and I think we cannot rely on pharmaceuticals to play that role for us. We need to actually, with the mechanisms in place, government needs to take their power and actually exercise those.
Priti, do you agree that governments are in the core of the issue that we need to address? Do they keep the mechanisms that we need to overcome?
I agree. I think governments could be doing a lot more right now. One of the reflections, I think I was mentioning to you all before when we were prepping for this panel, one of the reflections we've been having is that we've spent the better part of the last 2 decades calling on government to do more in very specific ways. Protect health in your systems for intellectual property. Think about public manufacturing. So where the market is failing, government steps in to manufacture the drugs and make sure they actually get to people. But more and more, we've been feeling that it's the way our entire market economy is organized that is not serving us anytime, but is not serving us during the pandemic in particular. And there are just very simple examples of that. If you take Gilead Sciences, for example, the drug remdesivir, which is now being shown not to, of course, have clinical benefit. But at the beginning, there was a lot of hype around that drug, right? And when we were thinking about its potential, this is a drug that was co-invested in, that had many people many years ago jointly working on it, investing in it, thinking about its potential. And then because of the way we lock up ownership rights through intellectual property and other systems, these types of developments are never worked on. They're never seen through. And so we don't have a real open science model in the world today. We don't have a way of collaborating across governments, continuing to progress science. We're so focused on making money. And so we see that also hurt the companies. Gilead is certainly not my favorite company, but I was watching them during the pandemic, and at one point they made several announcements which Wall Street responded to in a really neutral way, the pricing of their drug, or that they were working on remdesivir. And then one day they announced that they were going to partner with generic companies in low and middle income countries because they felt a moral responsibility to ensure that scale up could happen worldwide in the middle of a pandemic. And Wall Street responded really negatively, something around $6 billion in terms of how much the shares went down. And so I think we have to understand that we're not set up to respond to a pandemic. We don't have rules in place that explain how corporations shouldn't behave like corporations during a pandemic. There's no incentives. And that's where Candice is absolutely right. The government has to step in at that point. If this is the world we've set up and the way we want our economy organized, then this is the moment where government has a responsibility to step in and do things that aren't business as usual. And we're just not seeing that happen yet.
Thank you, Preeti. So you have governments, we have the mechanisms of the market system. You mentioned the role of Wall Street, of Gilead as a pharmaceutical company. Pauline, how do you see this issue from your perspective?
Well, what has been very, I would say, almost shocking for me during the first part of this pandemic is to see in France how much the government and the administrations, the public administrations, have given up the medicines policies to big pharmaceutical companies. I mean that all the production, all the research and development, the production and the supply chains are completely controlled by the pharmaceutical companies, and we see. For instance, if I take the example of diagnostics and PCR platforms, what we have seen in France is a deep, really impressive lack of understanding of the government and the administration on how it works, on how diagnostic works, because it's a very concentrated market with only a few big companies controlling this market, Abbott, Roche, Thermo Fisher, bioMérieux, Qiagen in general. So they control the in vitro diagnostic market in the world. And we see that in a situation like that, we see the administration, the public administration and the government lost a little bit. They don't really know how they can, what solutions they can put in place to respond to the emergency. So we have seen that on diagnostics. We also have seen that on the drug shortages that we have been facing during the crisis, in particular, where we realized that people at a very high level at the government in France didn't really know anything about how to buy active pharmaceutical ingredients, because usually they are used to completely rely everything on big pharmaceutical companies. In France, if Sanofi says we can produce this, then the government believes it and doesn't question it. So during this crisis, the government was lost. For me, that was one of the most shocking things. So I think we have to, and it's very challenging given the power of these multinationals, but I think one of the big challenge now it's for governments to feel that that they can produce these medicines, that they can that the medicines were developed. They have to remember that the medicines were developed also thanks to a lot of public money. So they have to feel that they own and they can control again these productions and guide the planification of the country and the health needs to fulfill the health needs in the countries.
Thank you, Pauline. So actually, governments need to realize that they have the power to act. But I'm asking to the three of you, do they even realize or recognize that there is a power imbalance on the beginning between public health and big pharma? I mean, do they even realize that the problem is there, that that is not being addressed, or they don't even recognize that it exists? I mean, it's a problem of the current global health system, but do you have any, I mean, when I say government is a big word, do you have like perhaps specific allies in the governments that realize that the power imbalance exists? Please just comment on your experiences. Candice, please.
Yeah. Yeah, I think from our side, I mean, speaking from South Africa, I think that there is a recognition that that this power imbalance exists, and I think with the government, they've been only recently also have been speaking out about, the issue around patents and how they affect access to medicine. Our government, or rather our president, has spoken quite, has been outspoken about the issue around patent, around the need for, for solidarity and coming together and ensuring that there's access, and one of those ways is also doing away with this patent system that actually disallows us from accessing these medical products. And I think also, considering also the move that has been taken by South Africa with the submission and the call for the TRIPS waiver, I think that's also one of the indications that, that there is that recognition that this is actually a critical role. And we've also seen also at the African Union level, in various communique, and I think they actually had a conference sometime in August where they recognize the issue, that they recognize how patents serve as a barrier to access. So I think there is now more a realization, and governments actually are becoming more and more outspoken about this issue and about this barrier, and how patents serve as a barrier around access.
But Candice has a South perspective. Candice, could you please just specify, clarify what is the waiver you're talking about, so that perhaps not everyone knows what you're talking about?
Okay, so what happened is that South Africa and India, so they submitted, they made a call for a waiver on the TRIPS. So these TRIPS mechanisms that are enacted by the WTO. So this would allow for any COVID-19 related medicine, products to not be patented, to allow for countries such as basically any country to be able to manufacture, to be able to produce the products that are required to meet the demands, local demands in their respective countries. So this waiver would ensure that the health technology that would obviously be patented is not patented for the duration of the pandemic.
That's perfect. Thank you. So, okay, you have a positive view on what has been done on governments by governments from the South. Preeti, do you have the same point of view? From which perspective do you see this recognition of power imbalance within the U.S. and perhaps as more globally, perhaps?
I'm trying to think what I want to say because there's so much coming out. I think governments know it. I think they know there's a power imbalance and it affects public health. And I think that governments like my own, like the United States, choose not to do anything about it. We've been saying, for example, since the hepatitis C cure came out in late 2013, early 2014, that people around the world with hepatitis C needed access to this 12-week course. And I was just reading that, today's only 7% have received it. And it's not for want of activism. So many of us have been fighting this fight now for 6-7 years. Government knows that people aren't getting the drugs. And this is where the relationship between who's not getting the treatments and vaccines also matters. For HIV, for hepatitis C, we saw so much structural marginalization, so many ways in which lower income people or people who were marginalized for other reasons worldwide would not get the access. So there's also that dimension to it about who's affected and who's not. In terms of pandemic treatments, when we started working on Roche's oseltamivir, that was before 2010, so maybe by 2008 or 2009. We were working, of course, on the patent issue, which is how are we going to make this go generic? How are we going to make sure everybody worldwide gets it? But what has emerged in the last decade about what governments and international health institutions knew and understood about this treatment, you're talking about everybody from the WHO to the CDC was approving the drug without really looking at the underlying data, a lot of which was sponsored by Roche. Billions of dollars were spent to stockpile this drug. And then almost a decade later, we see that the trials haven't even been completed, you know? So there's a market here also during pandemics that we as civil society have to be very, very, very aware of, because governments know, but in these moments of extreme crisis, they have to be seen to be acting. And that means showing partnership with the pharmaceutical industry, buying up lots of product, whether it's treatments or vaccines, that they don't even know if it works. And we see what happens for people as a result. It's deeply problematic. They know, and we need more people to join us in the movement to hold them accountable, because these are the types of actions. A decade after this happened with Roche and oseltamivir, there was no accountability. The BMJ, the British Medical Journal, and I think it was the Cochrane Group, they did this extraordinary investigation, which is the only reason we even know this, you know, but where is the accountability by governments after the fact? And where is the best practice, acknowledgement, reckoning, and then redefining of behavior by the companies? We're still not seeing that. I'm watching everything happen during COVID, and it feels the same. There's no real change happening yet.
Thank you, Preeti. And Pauline, so we have we have a fracture between the North and the South. If you listen to what Candice has said and Preeti, I would like to highlight your French. So you come from France, and we have seen Macron, for instance, taking a lot of good words, saying that the vaccine will be a world good for everyone in the world. And so we have what governments know, what they say, and how they act. And how do you see this from your perspective, coming from a place where you have been seeing your government taking statements, and you have seen the practice of it? So please tell us a little bit, how do you see these different levels of actions and discourses, and what governments know? Because you said governments didn't know how to make the industrial policy. They don't know what's happening. So please.
Yes. So first of all, yes. I mean, when I mention governments, there is not, I think, nothing such as government as a whole. I think we can clearly see a difference between countries in the south and countries where there are big pharmaceutical companies, for instance, France. So clearly, for me, that's a difference. But so of course, I was referring more to a country like France, and to the consequences. So to answer your question, Juliana, about Macron and the statements and what has been doing. Macron has clearly made the choice so far to pick for, to follow more to fulfill more the requests of pharmaceutical companies more than looking at the public interests. Clearly, in the economical and in the economical vision of Macron, it's clearly that it's the industry first. And according to him, the industry will regulate the society, or the development of the industry comes first. So when he made these statements in March saying that the COVID vaccine should be a common good, clearly there is a big gap between what he says and what actually he does in France. And what actually he has been doing in France is to take many decisions in favor of pharmaceutical companies, Sanofi in particular. So I don't believe Macron's statements, and I think Macron's statements are dangerous. They are dangerous in France because now there is people don't believe anymore the political speech, the language, because there is such a huge gap between what's being said and what's being done. You know, there is this feeling that the government says something, but then does exactly the opposite. And I think it's very dangerous for democracies in general. So I see in terms of focus more on pharmaceuticals, I think that clearly the strategy of Macron now, of France, is to do what the pharmaceutical companies ask for, even if it's against the public interest.
Thank you, Pauline. So, okay, so we have a problem of power imbalance. We have governments that react differently, and we have something that I wanted to ask you, because taking Candice's experience in South Africa, all the knowledge that civil society has acquired since the HIV/AIDS epidemic, what do our past experience taught us? What have we learned? Do you believe that that today the reaction of civil society is stronger than it was by the past, or do you feel that perhaps you don't have a lot of distance to realize it, or how do you perceive the moment of the HIV epidemics and today, in which the moment in which we are, there is more cohesion between civil society? How do you perceive it? Which lessons have we learned? Are we stronger than before? Candice, what do you think?
Yeah, so I definitely do see a role that, you know, civil society plays and can still play in this and during this pandemic, and with this particular issue that we're faced with. I think there definitely is a need, or rather, looking back to how how during the HIV and AIDS, how there was like a global mobilization. I think the mobilization was very much global, where countries, civil society activists from all over the world came together, in fighting a common fight. I think there is still that that momentum, but obviously I think it probably not as much stronger as it used to be. And I think there definitely is a need for us to come together, the global South, the global North, in solidarity, and mobilize more to, on a common good. I think there definitely is a need for that strong push. At the moment, I think there is work being done, and I think it would be unfair to discredit the work that is being done by civil society. And I think we're all fighting in our own very respective context. But I think something much more powerful would be us coming together more globally and fighting, or rather, just making our voices even louder, more on a global front, towards a specific call as well. I think that could be more powerful, and I think that need is still there. Having a very specific call that civil society is sort of pushing for. I think that getting together with on that common call is necessary for that. For us to be much stronger and our voices to be much louder.
Pretty. And how do you see that global South and global North has been collaborating in perspective of what you have experienced before in the AIDS pandemic?
Yeah, so to what Candice said, I mean, when I first got into this work, so many of us drew our inspiration from South Africa in the late 90s, and how the whole world sort of mobilized to make sure that not only could the lawsuit from Pharma, against the South African government be dropped, but that India could remain, MSF used to call it the world's pharmacy for the poor. And so much of our effort between 2000 and 2010 went to just making sure that patent laws and other sorts of trade pressures didn't affect India, didn't affect Thailand, didn't affect so many of the other countries who had the capacity to produce. You know, our movement has always been characterized, I think, by two things, like really technical solutions and a lot of public pressure. So I think South Africa in the late 90s, India, you know, around 2005, there have been these moments where there's these incredible like outpouring of support from the general public, from international institutions, from civil society around the world. And then it kind of trails off and goes quiet. Access to medicines has not yet become, you know, like climate change or women's rights, something that is just consistently there for the general public as something that needs prioritizing. And I think that'll only change with education. To your question about the Global South, and Pauline, feel free to correct me. Pauline and I have both worked very closely with many of our Global South partners over the last decade. I would offer the observation, you know, that I don't think we can underestimate what's happened in the last decade as governments have swung to the right. You're talking about now civil society organizations that are already under-resourced, that are already doing extraordinary work trying to fight, you know, the pharmaceutical industry, which is so well-funded and so powerful, but now are doing it in the face of really complex political situations in country. Many of our partner organizations need more visibility. They need more support. They need to be seen. They need more platforms for their stories to be told. And they need more attention, I think, from civil society in the global north, which has become, at least I'll speak for America, we've become very insular, firefighting against government here. But there's a real need to stand in solidarity with so many of our partners in countries that have just gone so far right that they're not even able to do their work anymore, where human rights work is getting cracked down on in countries like India. And I think there's a real need to figure out how are we going to look beyond ourselves right now in the North. I'll only speak for myself as an American, and really start to give more visibility and more amplification to those concerns.
Pauline, thank you, Priti. Pauline, from your years in ACT UP until today, now you work in the Observatoire, how do you see this progression on civil society movement and knowledge accumulated, and how we managed to mobilize today in perspective of how we did before? How do you see this from your perspective?
Well, I agree with Priti on the fact that we are in a very specific situation now with the pandemic, and it's difficult. I feel it's difficult to compare what we can do now during this pandemic as before last year. I mean, until last year, all the years until last year, because now all medias are focused on COVID. So we have a huge opportunity to, if you think about it, there is a huge opportunity to talk about medicines and health. And with the observatory, we have been trying to use this opportunity to put more in the public debate the issues of medicines and the price of medicines and the consequences on the health systems. But at the same time, there is so much media focusing on this that it's even more difficult. It gets more difficult to have our message got heard. Meaning that I think when we, as a Access to Medicines movement, when we were doing a press release, joint press release 10 years ago, I mean, maybe 10 years ago, it had some impact. But now, with all the things happening, it's very difficult to exist in the public space, in the media, to get our message heard. There's so much happening. And also, one of the other difficulty is, I mean, I've seen it also in France. It's very difficult to keep being in touch with our colleagues in other countries when there is so many things happening and things changing day after day after day, with emergencies one after the other to deal with. And so we feel, I mean, I've been feeling, and with my colleague Jerome, we have been feeling that we don't have the space, the time to talk to other people, and we should, and it would be great. But unfortunately, there is so many things happening and so little time, and that's very challenging.
Thank you, Pauline. Thank you very much, Preeti. Candice, I would like to ask you, perhaps Preeti, you can start because you have this whole background on IP and patents through your action in IMAC. So some solutions have been put in the table. We saw Candice in the beginning of our talked about the IP waiver proposed by India and South Africa. And I just want to make this, to bridge to you, Preeti, because, okay, let's say that you have a big, you have used a lot, for instance, of patent oppositions throughout your work in IMAC, which are tools that were usually used by, not by civil society, but by big pharma companies and pharmaceutical companies. And since the beginning of the pandemic, a lot of solutions regarding IP were put in the table. We have listened a little bit, but the IP waiver is more recent, but they were talking about patent pools and the experience of CTAP. I mean, in the aim of intellectual property rights, if we wanted to eradicate the pandemic, what should have been done by now?
So there are a few things that our movement has been asking for now for as long as I can remember. We've been asking governments to raise the bar on what it takes to get a patent. So the basic idea here is that a patent is supposed to be given for 20 years. It's supposed to be an exclusive right that an inventor gets. But what we've seen over the last, 40 years is an erosion of this system. It's basically that monopolies are getting longer and longer, and governments are basically just saying yes to everything. And when monopolies get longer, prices get higher, because during that time, a company is the only one who can be on the market. And so our movement has done a few things. First, we have called for law reform, and in some countries like India, we've been successful at actually reforming the laws. In other countries like Argentina, there are policies that have been passed or regulations to try to curb this phenomenon. But at the end of the day, there's been limited success in terms of actual law reform because the pharmaceutical lobbies are very strong. So civil society worldwide, and I'm forgetting how many countries now, but I think it's almost 50 countries, have started using this tool that used to be a tool of the pharmaceutical industry, where if a generic wanted to enter the market, they would basically litigate and say that the other big pharma companies' right was not valid. It wasn't inventive, it wasn't new, and they would knock the patent out and then they could enter the market because there was no more monopoly. And so in the early 2000s, again, a bunch of us started thinking about, well, what if we started to use this? And we started filing cases on life-saving drugs where low-income patients were not getting access to the drug. In Thailand, I think, started it, the US, then India, and then now you see that this is happening in 50 countries. And we've won case after case after case. We've unlocked billions of dollars in savings for health systems because generics get in there and competition drives the prices down. And millions of people for at least HIV and some other drugs have been put on, diseases have been put on treatment. I think there's growing recognition that this is a country by country battle. And so we all try to support each other, but ultimately like that, what is the phrase from South Africa, Candice? Is it fix the patent laws, like the campaign that the South Africans started, which is we actually have to go to the root of the problem. We have to reform the laws to protect public health and balance that private interest with the public health. That's something we are trying to now bring that spirit to the US. So many activists in so many countries have started these campaigns in their countries. And the question before us now is how do we build that solidarity? Because it's not just about COVID, right? It is about all the other diseases where treatments and vaccines aren't reaching people. And it's about the next pandemic and the next one and the one after that. So how are we building a better system is the question I think we're all very interested in addressing.
Thank you, Preeti. Candice, so it's no patents on pharmaceutical products, not only for COVID, or is raising the bar? with the patent system? What do you think?
Sorry, please repeat that question.
I was wondering if the solution would be no patents for pharmaceutical products and get back to before, the TRIPS agreement, or it would be raising the bar in the terms of like, okay, we keep the patents, but we make it more difficult when when patents are related to pharmaceutical products or health products.
No, I think, I mean, in the context of a pandemic, and I think this is where our system also needs to, consider, issues, factor in pandemics, when developing all these, policies and laws, and I think it actually makes sense to not have patents on COVID-19 related products for the duration of the pandemic. But I think also going forward, I think as Preeti has said, we have been calling for more stringent IP system, or rather the IP system to be a bit more stringent in terms of giving out patents, especially when it's not warranted. And I think this is a true reflection also for South Africa, where at the moment we don't have a sort of a stringent patent system. At the moment we just have a depository system where companies literally just need to have an application form and an application fee, and they're granted a patent just like that. There's no process of examination of the patent to actually qualify it that it's actually worth being granted a patent. So we definitely need to make our system a bit more tighter than it currently is, and also considering issues of a pandemic. And I think it's only right, it only makes sense to actually not have patents when it comes to COVID-19 related products, because we're faced with the reality where in as much as there are companies or companies producing certain products, it's not sufficient to respond to the global demand, and we will need a more localized sort of manufacturing and production of certain products to better respond to the pandemic. And it can't be done if we don't. It would prove impossible actually, and it can't be done if we continue protecting certain products through patents. And I think we're faced with that reality in South Africa, with issues around shortages of PPE, of testing material, testing kits, diagnostics. And I think it will be the case even for vaccines, where low and middle income countries are literally left to to basically figure things out for themselves, whilst your high income countries are making all these deals. So I think it is quite important to factor in that it can't be business as usual, because it's not and I think we need to consider that a health product is a matter of life and death. It's not just something that you can just make money off and profit out of. We're talking about people. And I think pharmaceuticals and everyone also who's involved needs to think that these are people's lives that are involved, that are actually impacted at the end of it, and they need to actually put some face value into all that is happening.
Thank you, Candice. And Pauline, just to link with what we have been talking about IP, because we said, we need to have tools for change. Okay, so you have been working on transparency, and you have also mentioned the importance of public production. So how could we link the patent system? I don't know if it's possible. The patent system, the issue of transparency, and the local production of pharmaceuticals. I said public production. Sorry.
Thank you, Juliana. I think that's a very good question. Actually, it's exactly what I wanted to say after Preeti and Candice on that. When we dig a little bit on who funded the research, we see a lot of public funding. So to grant for governments to grant patents to companies, okay. So we have to look if this fulfill the patentability criteria and all this, all the things that Preeti and Candice have been saying. But I think it's also important to see how much already the public sector has been investing on it, because there is no reason that that sometimes for health products that was developed thanks to public funding mostly or charity fundings. There is no reason that after a private sector company gets a patent on it for 20 years and exclusivity rights on it. So that's why I think there should be transparency to know if when we grant patents or when an agency or an institute from the public sector grants an exclusivity license to a company, we have to see if public money was invested, because there is no question that governments, that countries, public money pays several times for the same thing. And the second thing that you were referring to, Juliana, the public production, it's also critical, because we see barriers with patents, lots of barriers with patents, but we see also now and it's something that I worked a lot with Preeti for many years. The concentration of the market with pharmaceutical companies merging together or signing exclusivity contracts. So there are not so much competition in different areas for different kind of health products. There is not real competition. For instance, if we take the example of insulin was first patented 1 century ago. Then there were other patents granted, filed and granted for three companies that now share the global market. Now, there is the issue of intellectual property barriers on insulin, but there is also the issue of the concentration of the market, which is 3 companies sharing the global market and making it very difficult for any other actor to come in the market and to try to sell their own insulin. So we see that. We see also a lot of control around the active pharmaceutical ingredients, which makes the competition more difficult even when the TRIPS flexibilities are fully implemented. So it's another challenge, and that's why in these circumstances, to have a public production, maybe not for everything, but for key products, essential medicine, can be something very important as a leverage for governments to better negotiate the price, and also when they want to issue compulsory license, to really have the means to have the products available just after in the country.
Yeah.
So we have.
Can I just add to that? And I think
yes,
I think Pauline also raises like a very important point around public funding and publicly funded, research. And I think for us, also in mostly in African countries who we do a lot of clinical trials, and I think there is a need also, around issues around transparency on the clinical trial data, clinical trial funding, because governments and countries put in resources, they invest financial resources, and not just financial resources, but human capital that actually goes into doing these clinical trials. And I think there is a need for that to also be valued, especially, for countries like for South Africa, where we have 3 clinical trials, vaccine, so the COVID-19 vaccine clinical trials happening in South Africa. South Africa has put in some financial resources into that, our own, state resources go into that. And I think there is a need for that to be valued. I think there sometimes is this disconnect between, investment that goes into, you know, the early stage development of those products, and not so much on, say, your clinical trials. And I think there is a need for that to be valued, and also governments to use that as leverage, you know, when you know, negotiating for affordable, you know, and access to these products in the end. So I think the issue around transparency also sort of relates not just also to the early stage development, but also to, you know, clinical trials, and also the resources that actually are put into that, and then there is a need for that to be valued as well as a contribution.
Thank you, Candice. I'm just saying that we are almost in the end, but I want to say that we have very interesting questions, and I would like, from our audience, I would like to just read one of very interesting questions that give us a horizon to move on towards. So I'm just gonna read it, and please feel free to comment. As an alternative to taming big pharma, could we imagine the existence of an international open source research center or research centers, maybe as an initiative of the UN, that will be funded by member countries so they can later distribute the knowledge and products equally? Why wouldn't the WHO or some other non-profit international organization take part in research, production, and distribution of the drugs? Who would like to start? What do you think about this auditor question? I should say, Pretty, do you like to start? We have a problem with the sound, perhaps, Pretty. Pauline, do you feel comfortable?
Yes, I'm not sure I have the answer, but no, but of course it would be probably what one of the things that we need to have some independent agencies to work toward the development of health products that we really need globally, or that societies needs. The issue is how feasible is it when we see that already WHO struggles to do what it's supposed to do, and also to get funded. When we see the founders of WHO, we see that it's also difficult for WHO to, I mean, they also have to answer to the interests of some member state countries that can put a lot of pressure on them when they decide not to fund them anymore, for instance, or the Gates Foundation, that's also a big funder of WHO. So I think there is here, of course, there is a necessity. I think this is it would be critical to have this kind of international open source research centers, but we have to understand also, I think, that there is this conflict of interest between countries, and who wants maybe to answer more to the interest of the big pharmaceutical companies.
Pretty, or Candice? Pretty, are you back?
We have two Pretty.
We have two Pretties in the. Perhaps let's give a word to Candice, and perhaps we'll try to come back to you, Pretty. Candice.
Yeah. No, I think I agree with Pauline, and yeah, I think I actually, honestly, I think it would you know, also take institutions and countries, you know, coming together to make it work, because I would understand that there would be so many, you know, things, you know, that would be required to make that work. And I think also in terms of, you know, investment into that system would be one of those critical things that are required to make it a success. So I mean, and ideally it would be a great sort of alternative to have some open system sort of mechanism in place. But yeah, I think it would need some kind of leadership, I mean, from institutions like the WHO, you know, and United Nations to make it work.
Thank you, Candice. Pretty, are you back?
I will try one more time.
Yes. Is it a topic to bring countries together in order to...
Did this work?
It works, it works.
Yes, you're back. You're back. Thank you.
I would just say that I think that the WHO, Pauline's right, is extremely well funded by institutions and individuals. I'm getting a bad echo. I'm sorry.
Oh, we lost Pretty.
We lost Pretty.
We lost Pretty. Oh, that's a... Ah, she's back. Can we try? Yes, you're back.
Okay. I agree with what Pauline said and what Candice said. I would just add that I think part of the challenge here in doing open science and open R&D is that there has to be explicit recognition that the market fails in some aspects or many aspects in order to appropriately design this type of intervention. And right now, most of the major players in global health won't admit or acknowledge that. Everything works. Everything can be a win-win. We're winning. You know, we've gotten so many people treatment and vaccines. And it's a major problem because then if you're not willing to say, hey, I have faults too, the system has faults too, here's where they are, let's try to figure out how to fix them, then you're just designing something that we don't even need, in my opinion. And so I think that's the problem, is that cultural, and I don't mean culture like an individual country, I mean the mindset of being wedded to the market as it exists in its current form is holding us back from solving some of these problems. So for me, that kind of narrative change, that public pressure to say it's not working was a very important first step for institutions and philanthropy and others to really acknowledge where the failures are, and so we can move forward from there.
Thank you, Pretty. So I would say, like, just to finish, that the Humanitarian Congress is the place where we build new narratives. And I think that this experience was amazing to have all of you in different parts of the world together. So this is amazing to have a beautiful audience that I hope you have enjoyed this moment. And well, I would say goodbye for now. I hope to see all of you somewhere fighting for access to medicines. Pauline, Candice, Pretty, thank you very much. And we could stop right now. If you want to say a last word before leaving, perhaps?
No, thank you. Thank you so much for having us. It was a pleasure.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Juliana. Thank you.
Thank you to all of you and for the organizers of this panel. So I would say goodbye.
Bye.
Goodbye to everyone.